So first of all, Suresh is a stakeholder manager for Fields of Green for All. You can find them easily if you search online. And he's really interested in connecting with various stakeholders across the cannabis industry. He comes from an entrepreneurial background, having started a number of businesses. And he really believes in the economic opportunity of cannabis, and that lies in creating laws and policies that allows many entrepreneurs, especially among the neediest in our society, to enter into this space. And Fields of Green is definitely one of the more influential NGOs in this space that have done significant work. But he can tell you a bit more about that. So let's welcome, with all of that, Suresh, over to you. You're very welcome.
Hey, Mark. Hey, everyone, all the panelists. Thank you for all putting this together, and thank you to all the attendees for attending. So my name's Suresh. I am a stakeholder manager for Fields of Green for All, and in a nutshell, I try and build relationships to give Fields of Green a bigger platform to voice our legalization efforts. Mark, I just wanted to check, I see my video has cut off.
We can see you fine.
Perfect.
Yeah, we're hearing you fine.
Secondly, just want to apologize on behalf of Myrtle. She's actually just traveling today to Malawi. It's just having a bit of technical issues on the comm side, but she definitely wishes to have been here. And I just want to firstly start off by just paying a tribute to Jules Stobbs. He was murdered in early July, and we honestly hope that if he's zooming in from the cosmos, that we do him proud, as well as honor his legacy going forward. So what we are basically going to speak about is our commentary on the cannabis bill. And, Fields of Green for All is a non-profit company, and we are collectively reforming South Africa's cannabis laws together as a community. A large majority of our commentary, as well as our general input for legalization, is based on our cannabis manifesto. And this is a policy document that we've been working on for a number of years, and we're actually in the process of finalizing it for final release, with even new design works as well as update and content. So essentially, we're going to lead into the commentary, but before we do that, as Mark mentioned, we're going to just briefly speak about how we got to where we are today. And I think it's quite important that in order for us to know where we're going, we need to know where we came from. And a big part of what we speak about in our manifesto is actually about cannabis prohibition, the history of cannabis prohibition in South Africa. I'm just going to briefly run through this. It's not going to be a history lesson, but what happened was in the late 18th century, British colonizers brought Indian slaves to work in the sugar plantations in Natal. And those Indian slaves brought with them cannabis, or bhang, or dacha as it's known, as part of their tradition. And the British colonizers did not like the use of cannabis in any way whatsoever. And so what happened was the seeds of prohibition were planted in the late 18th century. We fast forward to 1924, at the League of Nations, which is the early form of the UN. Whilst they were putting opium under prohibition, South Africa stepped in and suggested that cannabis be added onto this list. So essentially, South Africa had a fundamental role on the war in drugs in general, but more specifically in cannabis. So a very unproudly South African moment. If we kind of fast forward through the decades, I mean, the war on drugs has wasted billions of government's money across the world. People have lost their lives either through incarceration or just losing their lives to this war. And so if we fast forward to 1992, we find that the Drugs and the Drugs Trafficking Act, as well as the Medicines and the Related Substances Control Act in South Africa, are the two main pieces of legislation blocking cannabis legalization. I'm sure Paul Michael will elaborate on this. What we start doing is, as we start edging closer to present day, about 10 years ago, Myrtle and Julian were raided by the police for alleged dealing in cannabis. And instead of paying the bribe, which I had to double check, I think they were asking for like 70,000 Rand or something, they decided to go on the offense because their rights were so violated, and they sued 8 government departments. And so in essence, that's how the Dhaka couple were born. And shortly after that, Fields of Green for All as an organization was formed to take this fight forward. That all basically culminated in what was known as the trial of the plant, which occurred in 2017. And what we used it for was to bring forth experts and evidence to dispel the so-called harms of the plant and rather focus on the harms of prohibition, which people often don't talk about. Unfortunately, during this trial of the plant, there were a number of delays or delay tactics used by the state, which ultimately led to the trial being put on hold. And a lot of taxpayer money, you and I, our taxpayer money was wasted in that process. In 2017, at the same time, concurrently, there was a High Court judgment in the Western Cape known as the Davis judgment, essentially where the judge or the High Court judge declared that cannabis prohibition is unconstitutionally incorrect. And so our trial of the plant, in addition to that Davis judgment, fast-tracked the 2018 Con Court ruling on the 18th of September, which based constitutional court ruling, where the judges unanimously said that they decriminalized cannabis growing, possession, and use in a private space, and that private space not limited to a residential dwelling. Unfortunately, the facts of the case at the time didn't speak about dealing, and the judges' hands were tied. And so they didn't make a judgment on dealing or selling cannabis. And so they basically said that government or parliament has 2 years to correct these laws. And so within the 2-year space up until now, that's what's happened. And so, as Mark said, in August 2020, Cabinet passed the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill, which is still up for public commentary up until the end of this month. And so based on that very brief history lesson, I'm just going to run through our commentary from Fields of Green for All. Just for time's sake, I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but just kind of our high-level observations. So really the first observation that we need to speak about is privacy, because this bill directly contradicts the 2018 Con Court ruling that protects our privacy in general. Because essentially, this bill speaks about plant counting as well as limits of how much dried cannabis can be held in your home. So the real question we need to ask ourselves is who's going to come into our homes to verify how many plants we're growing or how much weed we've got in our cupboard. And so what it boils down to, it seems from this bill, is that the police are heavily involved. And so from our own experience, we know that in order to enter someone's residence or search anyone's private property, you need a search warrant in order to do that. So the question is, are courts going to be granting search warrants in bulk to try and enforce this bill? And what we've seen from our own experience with being in the front lines of Fields of Green is that a lot of cannabis cases are thrown out of court simply because there was never a legitimate search warrant in the first place. Besides that, there's technicalities from the police side, etc. But it all boils down to putting a massive burden on our court system, which is already burdened, and wasting a lot of precious tax resources that South Africa doesn't have at the moment. If we're speaking about privacy from a practical point of view, the government makes no mention, and I'm sure Pilasande will elaborate on this as well, is that it doesn't take into account the fact that we've got high density, low income areas and townships in South Africa known as townships. And essentially in a township which is densely populated, you have many people staying within the same household, and even where house owners will rent out their backyards to put up an extra room to rent for residential, even informal business purposes. So if we combine the cannabis bill and the invasion of privacy with the practical fact that we live in a world with townships, is that many of those residents in those properties will be criminals with this bill, unbeknownst to them. So, you know, the government really needs to realize that there's limited privacy for many township residences or residents, and we need to take this into account, because ultimately the poorest are going to be victimized if this bill is implemented. Now, the second observation that I'm going to speak about after privacy is just how, the bill really highlights the harms of prohibition, how it outweighs or far outweighs the perceived harms of the plant. And our manifesto points out that the current laws are based on the perceived harms of cannabis. And the bill creates overly harsh penalties for exceeding plant counts or final dried cannabis amounts. Yet there's no empirical evidence to say where these perceived harms came from. So I'm just going to give a very simple example. The bill says that 2 adults cannot grow more than 8 plants in their household or have 1.2 kilos or kilograms of dried cannabis. But now the question is, if you double that, if you have 16 plants, 32 plants, or 5 kilos, where's the evidence that says that that amount is dangerous and therefore it deserves punishment by sending someone to prison? So it really doesn't make sense. And we do bring this up quite a lot in our manifesto document. And we've actually brought evidence in from experts such as Professor David Nutt, a world-renowned drug policy expert who has proven that cannabis is less dangerous than tobacco and alcohol. And therefore, these laws don't make sense in that regard. Second thing I'd just like to point out is this minor thing, but I mean, there are harsh penalties for smoking cannabis in public places, which is understandable. However, those penalties should be treated the same as bylaws for public alcohol consumption, as well as public smoking of tobacco. And so they should be treated the same. We don't need to treat cannabis as a different plant. Let's just treat it as the same as alcohol and tobacco. And again, as I mentioned, we've got evidence to show it's less dangerous than the other 2 vices. The third observation, and I think I'll speak a little bit more about this, is just around the police, and it ties into the privacy mentioned previously. This bill clearly defines what's non-compliance and the harsh consequences as a result. And Myrtle had to watch her husband die next to her in a very violent way. There's been zero progress on his case. It's quite embarrassing if I had to tell you what the series of steps that have occurred since Jules' passing. So sometimes I think people might get taken aback with our stance on police, but in reality, if they are not able to catch murderers, not just Jules, but 50 murders a day, but they want to arrest people for plants, it really doesn't make sense. Talking on the police, thanks to the work of Jules, Myrtle, the Fields of Green team, we've got over 100 stay of prosecutions. So what that means is any cannabis offences that made it to court put aside based on the outcome of the trial of the plant. So essentially, we've got over 100 people walking free because of the work that Fields of Green had laid down. In addition to that, we've also got over 300 documented cases of police overstepping their authority, violating human rights, despite court directives post the 2018 Concord ruling, basically saying leave the stoners alone. So we've found in general, based on this, is that there's a big disconnect between the police on the ground and upper police management, with a lack of the correct information flowing from top to bottom to everyday police. We're finding most cannabis-related arrests are being thrown out of court due to technicalities. So it's wasting police time, their resources, court resources, our resources. And so what we feel is that the police need to really build capacity in understanding this plant as well as the developments in the law, because there's a very clear disconnect in that. Or else what will happen is that the civil claims will keep mounting against the police, and ultimately the ones who end up paying for that are the taxpayers. So we were literally wasting money on an issue that shouldn't be there in the first place. Just something I want to elaborate on, just on the police. Very recently, Tito Mboweni, our finance minister, said that in order to prop up our South African Airway SOE airline, with over 10 billion rand, they needed to find the money somewhere, and they cut the budget departments across many government departments, police being one of them. Over 1 billion rand is going to be taken out of the police budget to prop up an airline, which is crazy. And we find that operationally, the police will not be able to enforce this bill or this proposed bill with the limited resources they have now and more limited in the very near future. And we also feel that it will create an environment that's very conducive for bribery. I mean, if police are not being paid what they're supposed to be being paid, it facilitates bribery and corruption. And we really need to stop that from the system, from the root or the baseline. And finally, the fourth observation is around plant botany and Cannabis 101. And this is actually, besides updating our manifesto, we're adding an entirely new chapter where we find that from beginning to end of this bill, it shows a total lack of understanding of cannabis as a plant, as well as how it's consumed, because the bill strictly speaks about cannabis being smoked. Meanwhile, we know that there are other ways to ingest cannabis, whether it's through edibles, through vaporizing, etc. So we're busy with this in our manifesto, and we feel it's a very simple stepping stone that should be understood first before we create laws about this plant. So finally, that's our comments on the bill, and obviously it's easy to criticize, it's harder to give recommendations, but I think with all the negative observations, the first thing we might have to commend is the fact that government have mentioned expungements of criminal records in this bill.
You've run out of time. Can I ask you to wrap up?
Yeah, 100%. It's great that expungements have been mentioned in the bill, and we really feel that the bill totally missed the mark on commercialization, and we speak about that more in our manifesto around cannabis hubs as well as DACA private clubs. And the final thing, just before I end off, is we are pushing for the formation of a cannabis ombudsman, which is essentially an independent cannabis regulatory body that's going to act as a middleman between government and cannabis industry, voicing any grievances from the industry and creating a dialogue platform. And finally, we'd just like to thank everyone for giving us this opportunity to voice our views. And we really think government needs to focus on cannabis, especially amongst or post this COVID-19 pandemic, which has decimated the economy. And we really need to unleash this plant in its entirety and not just focus on hemp and CBD and look at it as a whole. Thank you, Mark, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Suresh. Thanks for the input. Great. And thanks for those who are also sharing and commenting in the chat line.